The Tuscarora Night Vigil. Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get to the video. Fires that went cold at sunrise. North Carolina, the photograph secret. Professor Margaret Whitmore adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles as she carefully lifted the daguerreotype from its protective case. The photograph, no larger than her palm, bore the weight of a century's silence. In the sepia tone de images, she could make out the ghostly figures of Native Americans gathered around what appeared to be ceremonial fires, their faces turned skyward in what seemed to be a moment of profound reverence or desperate supplication. The inscription on the back, written in fading ink, read simply, "The Tuscarora Night Vigil, fires that went cold at sun." Margaret's office at Duke University was cluttered with the detritus of historical research, maps, documents, and photographs that told the stories of North Carolina's forgotten past. But this particular image had arrived that morning in a package with no return address, accompanied only by a brief note. "Professor Whitmore, I believe you'll find this of interest. The truth has been buried long enough." A friend, she had spent the better part of the afternoon examining the photograph under various magnifications, noting details that seemed to emerge from the shadows like whispers from the past. The positioning of the figures suggested a ritual of great significance, their bodies arranged in patterns that spoke of ancient traditions. But what struck her most was the expression of profound loss etched on the visible faces, as if they were witnessing the end of something irreplaceable. A knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. "Come in," she called, not looking up from the photograph. "Professor Whitmore." The voice belonged to Thomas Bercloud, one of her graduate students and a member of the Lumbee tribe. His research focused on the intersection of a section of Native American history and European colonization in the Carolinas. "I heard you received something interesting today." Margaret looked up, noting the careful way Thomas approached her desk. Word traveled fast in the small academic community, and she suspected that news of the mysterious photograph had already begun to circulate. "Thomas, perfect timing," she said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I was hoping to get your perspective on this." She handed him the daguerreotype, watching as his expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, recognition mixed with profound sadness. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It arrived anonymously this morning. Do you recognize it?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph as if it were a sacred object. "My grandmother used to tell stories," he said finally. "Stories about a night when the fires went cold. I always thought they were just stories." Margaret leaned forward in her chair. "What kind of stories?" "About the last gathering," Thomas replied, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "She said there was a time when all the tribes came together for one final ceremony. The Tuscarora, the Cherokee, the Catawba, even some who had been enemies for generations. They knew something was ending, something that could never be brought back." He set the photograph down carefully on Margaret's desk, as if it might crumble at any moment. "She said they kept the fires burning all night, trying to hold on to their connection to the land, to their ancestors, to each other. But when the sun rose, the fires went cold, and many of the people scattered to the winds." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "When did this supposedly happen?" 1980, Thomas said without hesitation. "The same year as the photograph." The coincidence was too significant to ignore. Margaret had studied enough of North Carolina's history to know that 1980 had been a pivotal year for the state's Native American population. The federal government had been implementing increasingly aggressive policies of assimilation and land redistribution, forcing many tribes to abandon their traditional ways of life or face complete displacement. "Thomas," she said carefully, "I think we need to investigate this further. This photograph might be documenting something historically significant, a gathering that's been lost to official records." Thomas nodded, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. Professor, if this is real, if this actually happened, then we're not just looking at a historical curiosity. We're looking at a sacred moment, a time of profound loss and transition for my people. Margaret understood his concern. The line between academic research and cultural exploitation was often thin, and she had seen too many scholars treat Native American history as mere subject matter rather than living heritage. We'll do this right, she promised, with respect, with community involvement, and with the understanding that this isn't just our story to tell. As Thomas left her office, Margaret found herself staring at the photograph again. The more she studied it, the more questions arose. Who had taken this image? How had they gained access to what was clearly a private, sacred ceremony? And why had it remained hidden for over a century? She reached for her phone and dialed the number for the North Carolina State Archives. If this photograph was authentic, there might be other records from 1980 that could provide context, government reports, newspaper articles, personal diaries that might shed light on this mysterious gathering. State Archives. This is Jennifer speaking. Jennifer, this is Margaret Whitmore from Duke. I'm hoping you can help me with some research into Native American activities in North Carolina around 2000. Margaret glanced at the photograph again, noting the way the firelight seemed to dance across the faces of the gathered people. I'm trying to find any records of a large intertribal gathering that may have taken place. It would have involved multiple tribes and might have been described as some kind of ceremony or vigil. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's oddly specific. Can you hold for a moment? As Margaret waited, she found herself drawn back to the photograph. There was something about the positioning of the figures that suggested this wasn't just a random gathering. The careful arrangement, the formal postures, the sense of ritual significance, it all pointed to something that had been planned and organized with great care. Professor Whitmore, Jennifer's voice returned, but it carried a different tone now. I found something interesting. There's a collection of documents that were donated to us about 10 years ago by a private collector. They include some materials from Tuscarora that mention Native American gatherings, but they've been restricted from public access. Restricted? By whom? The donor requested that the materials only be made available to qualified researchers working on specific projects related to Native American history in North Carolina. It sounds like your research might qualify. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. What would I need to do to gain access? You'd need to submit a formal request outlining your research project and its academic merit. The review process usually takes about a week. I'll have the request to you by tomorrow morning, Alamant said, already mentally composing her proposal. After hanging up, she returned to her examination of the photograph. Using a high-powered magnifying glass, she began to notice details that had escaped her initial observation. In the background, barely visible in the shadows, she could make out what appeared to be structures, not tipis or traditional dwellings, but something more permanent. Buildings that suggested this gathering had taken place near a settlement or town. She also noticed that several of the figures appeared to be wearing a mixture of traditional Native American clothing and European-style garments. This cultural blending was consistent with what she knew about Native American communities in Rio de Janeiro, when many tribes were being forced to adapt to changing circumstances while trying to maintain their cultural identity. But it was the faces that haunted her most. Even in the grainy sepia toned image, she could see the weight of loss and resignation in their expressions. These were people who knew they were participating in something that might never happen again, who understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. As the afternoon light faded outside her office window, Margaret found herself wondering about the photographer. In 1980, photography was still a complex and expensive process, requiring specialized equipment and considerable skill. The fact that someone had been present to document this gathering suggested either remarkable access or remarkable audacity. She made a note to researcher photographers who had been active in North Carolina during that period, particularly any who might have had connections to Native American communities. If she could identify the photographer, it might provide crucial context for understanding how and why this image had been created. The photograph seemed to pulse with secrets, each detail revealing new questions rather than answers. But Margaret was determined to uncover the truth behind this mysterious image. Somewhere in the archives and records of North Carolina's past, the story of the Tuscarora night vigil was waiting to be told, and she suspected that when that story finally emerged, it would reveal not just a forgotten moment in history, but a profound testament to the resilience and dignity of people facing the end of their world. The North Carolina State Archives building stood like a fortress of memory in downtown Raleigh, its red brick facade weathered by decades of Carolina summers and winters. Margaret arrived early on a crisp October morning, her research request having been approved with surprising speed. The archivist, Jennifer Mills, met her in the lobby with the kind of excitement that only fellow researchers could truly appreciate. "Professor Whitmore, we have to admit, your timing is remarkable," Jennifer said, as she led Margaret through security and into the climate-controlled depths of the building. "The collection you're interested in was just processed last month. Before that, it had been sitting in storage for nearly a decade." They descended into the basement archives, where rows of metal shelving stretched into the shadows like a library of forgotten lives. The air smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals, the distinctive scent of history carefully maintained. "The Don was a man named Edmund Hartwell," Jennifer explained as they walked. "He was a private collector who specialized in North Carolina history, particularly materials related to the post-Civil War period. When he died, his estate donated his entire collection to us." She stopped at a table where several boxes had been arranged, each labeled with meticulous care. "These are the materials from one Hartwell, apparently a particular interest in that year. Said it was a turning point for the state in ways that most people didn't understand." Margaret felt a familiar thrill as she approached the boxes. This was the moment she lived for, the possibility of discovery, of finding pieces of the past that could reshape understanding of history. "What kind of materials are we looking at?" she asked. "A mixture," Jennifer replied, opening the first box. "Personal correspondence, government documents, newspaper clippings, and some items that are, well, you'll see." The first box contained letters, dozens of them, arranged chronologically throughout. Margaret began with January, noting that many of the correspondences were between government officials discussing the Indian situation in various counties across North Carolina. One letter, dated February 5th, it was from a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent named William Thornton to his supervisor in Washington. "The situation here grows more complex by the day. The various tribes that remain in the state have begun communicating with each other in ways we have not seen before. Our informants report meetings and gatherings that seem to be coordinated across tribal lines. I feel they may be planning some form of organized resistance to the new land policies." Margaret photographed the letter with her phone, then continued reading. By spring, the tone of the official correspondence had grown increasingly urgent. A letter from May described an unusual activity among the Tuscarora, Cherokee, and Catawba populations, with reports of messengers traveling between communities that had historically maintained little contact. "Jennifer," Margaret called softly, "have you read through all of these?" The archivist looked up from her own work at a nearby table. "I've skimmed them, but I haven't done a detailed analysis." It looks like there was significant concern among government officials about Native American activities in it, much more than I would have expected for that period. Jennifer joined her at the table, looking over Margaret's shoulder at the letters. "That's interesting. Most of the historical narratives I'm familiar with suggest that by 1880, the Native American populations in North Carolina had been largely pacified and assimilated. Margaret shook her head. These letters suggest something very different. It sounds like there was active coordination between tribes, possibly in response to federal policies. She continued through the correspondence, noting a pattern of increasing anxiety among officials as the year progressed. With summer, the letters mentioned specific concern about a gathering that was being planned for the fall. A letter dated Augusta for Odette Eden was particularly revealing. We have confirmed reports that representatives from at least 6 tribal groups are planning to convene sometime in October. The purpose of this gathering remains unclear, but our sources suggest it may be related to some form of religious or ceremonial observance. I have requested additional personnel to monitor the situation. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. October 1870, the same time frame as the photograph. She was beginning to see the outline of a story that had been hidden from official histories. The second box contained the newspaper clippings from various North Carolina papers throughout the year. Most were brief mentions of Indian activities or tribal movement, but one article from the Raleigh News and Observer, dated October 5, 1870, made Margaret a breath catch. Mysterious fires reported in western counties. Residents of Robeson and surrounding counties report unusual fire activity in remote areas over the past several nights. The fires appeared to be controlled and ceremonial in nature, leading to speculation about their purpose. Local authorities are investigating, but no official explanation has been provided. Margaret photographed the article, her excitement growing. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Official concern about tribal gatherings, reports of ceremonial fires, and a photograph documenting what appeared to be exactly such an event. The third box contained the most intriguing materials yet. Along with more correspondence, there were several items that seemed out of place in a typical archival collection. A piece of charred wood, a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be tobacco, and a folded piece of cloth that had been carefully preserved. But it was the journal that made Margaret's hands tremble as she opened it. The leather cover was worn smooth by handling, and the pages were filled with careful handwriting in faded ink. The first entry was dated September 1, 1870, and the author identified himself as Dr. Samuel Morrison, a physician from Lumberton. I have been asked to document what may be the most significant gathering of native peoples in this region since the colonial period. The trust placed in me by the tribal leaders is both an honor and a burden, as I understand that what I witness may never be seen again. Margaret read on, fascinated by Morrison's detailed observation. It described weeks of preparation, with messengers traveling between communities to coordinate the gathering. The purpose, he wrote, was both ceremonial and practical, a final attempt to preserve cultural traditions and sacred knowledge before they were lost forever. October 10, 1880. Many wear traditional dress, but others have adopted European clothing. All seem united in their understanding that this may be their last opportunity to come together in this way. Morrison's entries became increasingly detailed as the gathering progressed. It described elaborate ceremonies, the sharing of stories and songs, and intense discussions about how to preserve their cultural heritage in the face of increasing pressure to assimilate. October 12, 1880. Tonight they will kindle the sacred fires. I have been told that these fires represent a connection between the people and their ancestors, between the present and the eternal. The ceremony will continue until sunrise, when the fires will be allowed to die naturally. It is, they tell me, a way of honoring what has been while accepting what must come. Margaret's hands were shaking as she read the final entries. Morrison described the night Vigil in detail, the careful arrangement of the fires, the positioning of the participants, the songs and prayers that continued through the darkness. October 13, 1880. As dawn approached, I witnessed something I will never forget. As the fires began to die, the people stood in silent acknowledgement of what was ending. There were tears, but also a profound dignity. They understood that they were not just ending a ceremony, but closing a chapter of their history that could never be reopened. The final entry was brief but haunting. The photographer was present, though I do not know how he gained permission to document such a sacred moment. Perhaps the leaders understood that this image would be the only proof that this gathering ever occurred. When the fires went cold at sunrise, many of the people scattered to different parts of the state and beyond. Some, I fear, I will never see again. Margaret sat back in her chair, the weight of Morrison's words settling over her like a shroud. The photograph she had been studying wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was documentation of a moment of profound cultural transition, a final gathering of people who knew their world was ending. "Jennifer," she called softly, "I think we found something extraordinary." As she continued reading through Morrison's journal, Margaret began to understand that the Tuscarora night vigil represented more than just a ceremonial gathering. It was a deliberate act of preservation, an attempt to ensure that something essential would survive even as everything else was being swept away by the tide of history. The photograph, she realized, was not just an image but a testament, proof that these people had existed, had gathered, had honored their traditions one final time before the fires went cold and the world changed forever. "I want to know how far this message is reaching. Comment below and tell me which city or country you're watching from." 3 days after her discovery in the archives, Margaret found herself driving through the winding roads of Robeson County, following directions that had been scrawled in the margin of Dr. Morrison's journal. Thomas Cloud sat in the passenger seat, studying a hand-drawn map that Morrison had included with his notes. According to this, Thomas said, the gathering took place near what Morrison called the old settlement somewhere along the Lumber River, about 5 miles south of Lumberton. Margaret navigated another curve, the October landscape blazing with fall colors that seemed to echo the fires described in Morrison's journal. "Have you had any luck identifying the photographer?" Thomas nodded, pulling out a folder of documents he'd compiled over the past few days. "I think I found him. There was a photographer named Jacob Whitman, who was active in this area during the 1800s. He specialized in documenting what he called the vanishing frontier, Native American communities, rural settlements, that sort of thing." "What do we know about him?" "That's where it gets interesting," Thomas replied. "Whitman wasn't just a photographer. He was also a journalist, and according to some sources, a sympathizer with Native American causes. He wrote several articles for northern newspapers about the treatment of tribes in the South." Margaret slowed as they approached what appeared to be the area marked on Morrison's map. The landscape was largely unchanged from what it might have been in 1800. Rolling hills covered with pine and oak, the Lumber River meandering through bottomland that still showed signs of ancient cultivation. There, Thomas pointed to a clearing visible through the trees. "That looks like it could be the place." They parked at the side of the road and walked into the clearing, their footsteps muffled by decades of fallen leaves. The space was roughly circular, perhaps 100 yards across, with the river visible through the trees on one side. Margaret could easily imagine it filled with people, fires, and the ceremonies Morrison had described. "Look at this," Thomas called from the center of the clearing. Margaret joined him and saw what had caught his attention, a series of circular depressions in the earth, barely visible, but clearly artificial. The patterns matched what she remembered from the photograph, multiple fire circles arranged in a specific configuration. "These could be the fire pits," she said, kneeling to examine one of the depressions more closely. "After cuanto years they're barely visible, but the arrangement is exactly what we see in the photograph." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the clearing with an expression that mixed reverence with sadness. "My grandmother was right," he said finally. "This really happened. They really gathered here." As they explored the site, Margaret found herself thinking about Jacob Whitman and how he had managed to document such a private, sacred ceremony. The more she learned about the gathering, the more remarkable it seemed that any outsider had been allowed to witness it. let alone photograph it. "Thomas," she said, "I want to find out more about Whitman. If we can understand how he gained access to the ceremony, it might tell us something important about the gathering itself." They spent another hour at the site, taking photographs and measurements, trying to match what they saw with Morrison's descriptions and the mysterious daguerreotype. As they prepared to leave, Thomas paused at the edge of the clearing. "Professor," he said, "there's something I need to tell you. After you showed me that photograph, I called my grandmother. She's 93 now, and her memory isn't what it used to be. But when I described the image to her, she became very agitated." Margaret stopped walking. "Agitated how?" "She said the photograph was never supposed to exist. According to the stories she heard from her own grandmother, the people who attended the gathering made a pact. No record of the ceremony was to be kept, except in memory and oral tradition. The presence of a photographer would have been seen as a violation of that agreement. This revelation added a new layer of complexity to the mystery. If the photograph had been taken without permission, it raised ethical questions about its use as historical evidence. But if it had been authorized, it suggested that the gathering's organizers had made a deliberate decision to preserve a visual record despite their traditions. Back in Durham that evening, Margaret began researching Jacob Whitman in earnest. She found references to him in several photography journals, from the 1880s, where he was described as an innovative practitioner of documentary photography. His work had been exhibited in New York and Philadelphia, and he had gained a reputation for his sensitive portrayals of marginalized communities. But it was a letter she found in the Duke University archives that provided the breakthrough she was looking for. The letter, dated November 15, 1908, tells his brother in Pennsylvania, "I have just returned from what may be the most important assignment of my career. Through connections I cannot fully explain, I was granted permission to document a gathering of native peoples that may have been the last of its kind in this region. The trust placed in me was extraordinary, and I am still struggling to understand why I was chosen for this honor." Whitman went on to describe the ceremony in terms that closely matched Morrison's journal entries, but from the perspective of someone who understood the significance of what he was witnessing. They knew this was ending James, not just the ceremony but their way of life, their connection to the land, their ability to gather as they had for generations. "The photograph I took was not meant for exhibition or sale. It was taken at their request, as a record for future generations who might otherwise never know that this gathering occurred." The letter continued with details that made Margaret's pulse quicken. The tribal leaders explained that they wanted one image to survive, one proof that they had honored their traditions even as the world changed around them. "They chose me not because I was the best photographer available, but because I had demonstrated respect for their communities in my previous work. The photograph is to remain hidden until a time when it can be shared without causing harm to those who participated." Margaret sat back in her chair, the implications of Whitman's letter washing over her. The photograph hadn't been taken without permission. It had been commissioned by the gathering's participants as a deliberate act of historical preservation. They had understood that their ceremony might be forgotten or denied, and they had wanted proof that it had occurred. But Whitman's reference to keeping the photograph hidden until a time when it can be shared without causing harm suggested that its recent appearance was not accident. Someone had decided the time was right for this story to be told. She reached for her phone and called Thomas. "I think I know why the photograph surfaced now," she said, when he answered. "What do you mean?" "The people who attended the gathering in it, the last generation that might have been directly affected by the revelation of this ceremony, has passed away. Someone who knew about the photograph's existence decided it was finally safe to share it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That would mean someone has been keeping this secret for over a century, waiting for the right moment to reveal it." "Exactly. And I think I know who that someone might be." Margaret had been thinking about the anonymous note that had accompanied the photograph. The truth has been buried long enough. The phrasing suggested someone with a personal connection to the story, someone who had been waiting for the right moment to bring it to light. Thomas, I need you to help me with something. Can you reach out to your community contacts and see if anyone knows about families who might have preserved materials from the Tuscarora gathering? I have a feeling that whoever sent me this photograph has more than just the image. As she hung up the phone, Margaret found herself thinking about the weight of secrets and the courage it took to reveal them. The Tuscarora night, Vigil, had been hidden for 140 years, protected by a conspiracy of silence that had preserved both the dignity of its participants and the integrity of their final gathering. But now, with all the original participants gone and their immediate descendants no longer at risk, someone had decided that the story needed to be told. The photograph was not just evidence of a historical event, it was a message from the past, a reminder that even in moments of ending, people could choose dignity, ceremony, and hope. Margaret realized that her role was not just to analyze the photograph as a historical artifact, but to serve as a bridge between the past and present, helping to ensure that the story of the Tuscarora Night Vigil was told with the respect and understanding that its participants had deserved. The fires had gone cold at sunrise in 1880, but their light was finally beginning to shine again. The call came on a rainy Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Margaret's visit to the gathering site. Thomas's voice carried an excitement that was barely contained as he spoke into the phone. "Professor, you need to come to Pembroke immediately. I found her." "Found who?" "Margaret." Yes, so she suspected she already knew. The keeper of the photograph. The person who's been waiting for years to tell this story. An hour later, Margaret found herself sitting in the modest living room of a house on the outskirts of Pembroke, the heart of the Lumbee community in Robinson County. Across from her sat a woman who appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of generations. "Professor Whitmore," Thomas said, "I'd like you to meet Mary Axendine. She's the one who sent you the photograph." Mary studied Margaret with an intensity that was both welcoming and appraising. "I've been waiting a long time to meet someone who would understand the importance of what I have to share," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of the region. "Miss Oxendine," Margaret began, "I have so many questions." Mary held up a hand, silencing her gently. "Before we talk about the photograph, you need to understand the story behind it. The real story, not just what you can piece together from archives and documents." She rose from her chair and walked to an old wooden chest that sat beneath the front window. From it she withdrew a leather portfolio that looked as old as the photograph itself. "My great-great-grandmother was at the gathering," Mary said, returning to her seat with the portfolio in her lap. Her name was Sarah Leclerc, and she was one of the organizers. She was also the one who convinced the others to allow the photograph to be taken. Mary opened the portfolio carefully, revealing not just the original daguerreotype that Margaret had been studying, but several other items, letters, sketches, and what appeared to be a detailed account written in a careful hand. Sarah understood something that many of the others didn't. Mary continued. She knew that no matter how carefully they preserved their stories in oral tradition, there would come a time when people would deny that the gathering ever happened. She wanted proof that couldn't be dismissed or forgotten. Margaret leaned forward, her academic excitement tempered by the solemnity of the moment. Why did she choose Jacob Whitman as the photographer? Mary smiled, the expression transforming her face. That's where the story gets interesting. Whitman wasn't chosen randomly. It was Sarah's cousin. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her cousin, Sarah's grandmother, was a Tuscarora woman who married a white settler named Leclerc. Their daughter, Sarah's mother, married into the Lumbee community. But Sarah maintained connections with her Tuscarora relatives, including a branch of the family that had intermarried with white settlers and taken the name Whitman. Mary pulled out a family tree that had been carefully maintained across generations. Jacob Whitman was Sarah's second cousin. He had grown up hearing stories about his native heritage, and he had used his position as a photographer to document native communities throughout the region. When Sarah needed someone she could trust to take the photograph, she reached out to family. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with startling clarity. Margaret realized that the gathering hadn't just been documented by an outsider who had gained unusual access. It had been documented by someone who was, in a sense, coming home. But why keep it secret for so long? Margaret asked. Mary's expression grew serious. Because 1980 was a dangerous time for Native people in North Carolina. The federal government was implementing policies designed to force assimilation or remove any evidence of organized tribal activity could have been used to justify even harsher measures. She pulled out a letter from the portfolio, its paper yellowed with age. This is from Sarah to Jacob, written a week after the gathering. She explains why the photograph had to remain hidden. Margaret read the letter carefully, noting Sarah's elegant handwriting and formal tone. Dear cousin Jacob, the image you captured will serve as proof for future generations that we did not simply disappear or surrender our identity without ceremony, but it must remain hidden until such time as its revelation cannot be used to harm those who participated or their descendants. He entrusts this responsibility to you and your heirs, with the understanding that the photograph should only be shared when it can serve to honor rather than endanger our people. The photograph has been passed down through both families, Mary explained. The Wetmans kept the original, while we maintain copies in the supporting documents. Each generation has had a keeper, someone responsible for deciding when the time was right to reveal the story. Margaret looked up from the letter. And you decided that time is now? Mary nodded. The last of the participants' children died 5 years ago. There's no one left who could be harmed by the revelation. And with all the discussions about Native American history and the need for more accurate narratives, I felt it was time for this story to be told. Thomas, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. Mrs. Oxendine, can you tell us more about what actually happened at the gathering? The documents we found give us some details, but Mary smiled and pulled out what appeared to be a journal bound in soft leather. Sarah kept detailed notes about the planning and execution of the gathering. She wanted future generations to understand, not just that it happened, but why it was necessary. She opened the journal and began to read in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of the past. We knew that the old ways were ending. The government schools were taking our children and teaching them to be ashamed of their heritage. The land allotment policies were breaking up our communities. The missionaries were telling us that our ceremonies were evil and our beliefs were false. We could see that within a generation or two, much of what we had preserved for centuries would be lost forever. Mary looked up from the journal. The gathering wasn't just a ceremony, it was a conscious effort to preserve as much cultural knowledge as possible before it disappeared. They shared songs, stories, medicinal knowledge, spiritual practices. They taught the younger participants things that might otherwise have been lost. She continued reading from Sarah's account. We invited representatives from all the tribes that remained in the region. Some had been enemies in the past, but we understood that our survival depended on unity. We spent 3 days sharing knowledge and 3 nights in ceremony. The final night, the night of the Vigil, was when we acknowledged that this might be our last gathering, as free people practicing our traditional ways. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes as she listened to Sarah's words. The gathering had been both a celebration and a funeral, a way of honoring the past while accepting an uncertain future. The fires, Mary continued, represented the connection between the people and their ancestors. As long as the fires burned, that connection remained strong. When they were allowed to die at sunrise, it symbolized the end of an era, not the end of the people, but the end of their ability to live as they always had. She closed the journal and looked directly at Margaret. That's why the photograph is so important. It captures the moment when our ancestors chose dignity over despair, ceremony over surrender. They knew they couldn't stop the changes that were coming, but they could control how they responded to those changes. As the afternoon wore on, Mary shared more documents and artifacts from the gathering. pieces of pottery that had been made during the 3 days, samples of medicinal plants that had been gathered and blessed, even fragments of the wood from the sacred fires. My family has been the keepers of this collection for 5 generations, she said. Each keeper has added to it, preserving not just the artifacts but the stories that give them meaning. Now it's time for these stories to become part of the larger historical record. Margaret realized that she was being offered something extraordinary. Not just access to historical materials, but partnership in telling a story that had been carefully preserved across generations. The responsibility was both thrilling and daunting. Oxendine, she said carefully, if you're willing to share this story publicly, want to make sure we do it in a way that honors your ancestors' intentions. This isn't just academic research, it's living history that belongs to your community. Mary smiled, and Margaret could see approval in her eyes. That's exactly why I chose to contact you, Professor Whitmore. Your reputation for respectful scholarship preceded you. I believe you understand that this story isn't just about the past, it's about helping people today understand the resilience and dignity of Native communities. As Margaret prepared to leave, Mary handed her a small bundle wrapped in soft cloth. This is for you to keep, she said. It's a piece of charcoal from one of the sacred fires. Sarah saved it as a reminder that even when fires go cold, their warmth can be rekindled by those who remember their light. Driving back to Durham that evening, Margaret felt the weight of the charcoal in her pocket and the even greater weight of the responsibility she had accepted. The Tuscarora night vigil was no longer just a mysterious photograph. It was a story of courage, preservation, and hope that had been waiting 140 years to be told. The fires had gone cold at sunrise in 1880, but their light was about to shine brighter than ever. The Duke University auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles despite fire regulations. Word spread through academic circles and Native American communities across the region about Margaret's presentation on the Tuscarora night vigil, and the response had been overwhelming. Margaret stood at the podium, looking out at faces that represented a cross-section of North Carolina's complex cultural landscape. She saw fellow historians and anthropologists, members of various tribal communities, students and community members who had driven hours to hear this story that had been hidden for nearly a century and a half. Before I begin, Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system, I want to acknowledge that this story doesn't belong to me. I am simply the vessel through which it is being shared. The real credit belongs to the families who preserved this history across 5 generations, waiting for the right moment to bring it to light. She clicked to her first slide, which showed the daguerreotype in all its haunting detail. A murmur ran through the audience as people leaned forward to study the image. This photograph was taken on the night of October 12. It documents what may have been the last large intertribal gathering in the southeastern United States. A ceremony that its participants called the Night Vigil, when fires were kept burning until sunrise as a way of honoring the past and accepting an uncertain future. Margaret has spent weeks preparing this presentation, working closely with Mary Oxendine and other community members to ensure that the story was told with appropriate respect and accuracy. Thomas sat in the front row, along with several other members of the Lumbee community who had contributed their own family stories and memories to the research. To understand the significance of this gathering, Margaret continued, we need to understand the context of this was a time when federal policies were designed to force Native American assimilation or removal. Traditional ways of life were being systematically dismantled, and many communities faced the choice between cultural extinction and physical displacement. She clicked to a map showing the locations of various tribal communities in North Carolina during the 1880s, noting how federal policies had fragmented and scattered populations that had lived in the region for centuries. What makes the Tuscarora night vigil remarkable is that it represented a conscious decision by tribal leaders to come together one final time. Despite the risks involved, they understood that their traditional ways of gathering and practicing their ceremonies were ending, and they wanted to preserve as much cultural knowledge as possible before it was lost forever. Margaret shared excerpts, Morrison's journal and Sarah Leclerc's writings, painting a picture of careful planning and profound purpose. She described the 3 days of knowledge sharing that preceded the night vigil, the participation of multiple tribal groups that had historically been separate or even antagonistic, and the deliberate decision to document the ceremony through photography. The photographer, Jacob Whitman, wasn't an outsider who somehow gained access to a private ceremony, she explained. It was family, a cousin of one of the organizers, who had been specifically chosen because of his demonstrated respect for native communities and his understanding of the significance of what he was documenting. As Margaret shared more details about the gathering, she could see the emotional impact on her audience. Many of the Native American attendees had tears in their eyes, recognizing in this historical account echoes of their own family stories of loss and resilience. The night vigil itself was both a celebration and a mourning. Margaret continued. The fires represented the connection between the people and their ancestors, between the present and the eternal. As long as the fires burned, that connection remained strong. When they were allowed to die at sunrise, it symbolized not the end of the people, but the end of their ability to live as they always had. She clicked to a slide, showing the circular depressions that she and Thomas had found at the gathering site, explaining how the physical evidence corroborated the historical accounts. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is what happened after the gathering. The photograph and supporting documents were deliberately hidden for Fuente Juantajioles, preserved by families who understood that the time would come when this story could be shared without causing harm to the descendants of those who participated. Margaret introduced Mary Oxendane, who had agreed to speak about her family's role as keepers of the story. Mary approached the podium with the same dignity that Margaret had come to associate with her, carrying herself like someone who understood the weight of the moment. My great-great-grandmother, Sarah Leclerc, was one of the organizers of the gathering, Mary began, her voice strong and clear. She understood that people would try to deny that this ceremony ever happened, that they would claim our ancestors simply disappeared or gave up their identity without resistance. She wanted proof that couldn't be dismissed or forgotten. Mary spoke about the decision to commission the photograph, the careful preservation of documents and artifacts across generations, and the responsibility that each keeper had felt to protect the story until the right moment arrived. We waited until all the participants and their children had passed away, she explained. We waited until the revelation of this story couldn't be used to harm anyone. And we waited until we found someone who would tell it with the respect and understanding it deserved. The audience was completely silent as Mary concluded her remarks. The weight of in the 14 years of carefully guarded secrets settling over the auditorium like a benediction. During the question and answer period that was, Margaret was struck by the range of responses to the presentation. Academic colleagues asked about methodology and sources, while community members shared their own family stories that connected to the larger narrative of cultural preservation and loss. One elderly Cherokee man stood to speak, his voice trembling with emotion. My grandfather used to tell stories about a great gathering where all the tribes came together one last time. I always thought they were just stories, legends that got passed down and changed over time. To know that it really happened, to see proof that our ancestors chose dignity even in the face of ending, it changes everything. A young Lumbee woman asked about the implications of the discovery for contemporary Native communities. What does this story mean for us today? How do we honor what our ancestors preserved? Margaret looked to Mary, who nodded for her to respond. I think this story reminds us that cultural preservation isn't just about maintaining traditions, it's about making conscious choices about how we respond to change and challenge. The people who gathered in 1880 couldn't stop the forces that were transforming their world, but they could control how they faced those changes. As the formal presentation ended and people began to mingle, Margaret found herself surrounded by individuals who wanted to share their own connections to the story. Some had family members who had attended the gathering, others had heard fragments of the story in oral traditions that had been passed down through generations. Thomas approached her as the crowd began to thin. "Professor, I think you've started something important here. This isn't just about one historical event. It's about changing how we understand Native American history in the Southeast." Margaret nodded, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated by the evening's events. "The story was always there, Thomas. We just helped bring it to light." As she packed up her materials, Margaret thought about the piece of charcoal that Mary had given her, now sitting on her desk at home, as a reminder of fires that had gone cold, but whose light continued to shine. The Tuscarora night vigil had ended at sunrise in 1880, but its message of dignity, resilience, and hope was just beginning to reach the audience it had always been intended for. The photograph had done its job. It had preserved proof that the gathering had occurred, that the people had chosen ceremony over surrender, that even in moments of ending, there could be beauty and meaning and hope. Now it was up to future generations to decide what to do with that knowledge, how to honor the sacrifice and wisdom of those who had kept the fires burning through the longest night of their history. 6 months after the presentation at Duke University, Margaret stood once again in the clearing along the Lombard River, where the Tuscarora night vigil had taken place. Nearly 300 people had gathered for what organizers were calling a remembrance ceremony, an event designed to honor the memory of the dead. The crowd was diverse, representing not just the Lumabi, Tuscarora, Cherokee, and Catawba communities that had been present at the original Vigil, but also scholars, students, and community members from across North Carolina and beyond. The story of the hidden photograph and the long-preserved secret had captured imaginations far beyond academic circles. Mary Oxendine stood at the center of the clearing, now recognized as an elder and keeper of important cultural knowledge. In the months since the story had been revealed, she had become a sought-after speaker and consultant, helping museums and universities understand the importance of community-controlled historical narratives. "We gather here not to recreate what happened in 1880, Mary said, her voice carrying across the clearing, but to honor the memory of those who chose dignity in the face of ending, who preserved their cultural knowledge even as their world was changing forever." Margaret watched as representatives from various tribal communities came forward to light fires in the same circular pattern that had been documented in the photograph. Each fire was lit with ceremony and intention, accompanied by prayers and songs that connected the present moment to the ancestral past. Thomas approached Margaret as the fire-lighting ceremony continued. "Have you seen the latest developments?" he asked, handing her a folder of documents. Margaret opened the folder to find newspaper clippings, academic articles, and correspondence from museums and cultural institutions across the country. The story of the Tuscarora night vigil had sparked a broader conversation about hidden histories and the importance of community-controlled narratives. The Smithsonian wants to include the photograph in a major exhibition on Native American resistance and resilience, Thomas explained. And 3 universities have started research projects looking for similar hidden histories in their own regions. Margaret smiled, thinking about how the revelation of one carefully preserved secret had opened doors to countless other stories that had been waiting to be told. "Mary was right," she said. "The time was right for this story to emerge." As the sun set and the fires began to cast dancing shadows across the gathering, Margaret found herself thinking about the circular nature of history, how the past and present seemed to converge in moments of recognition and understanding. Elena Rodriguez, who had driven down from Virginia for the ceremony, joined Margaret and Thomas near one of the fires. "I've been thinking about what this discovery means for our understanding of historical documentation," she said. "How many other stories are out there, carefully preserved by families and communities, waiting for the right moment to be shared? It was a question that had been haunting Margaret since the beginning of this journey. The Tuscarora night vigil had been hidden in plain sight for 120 years, preserved by people who understood the importance of timing and context in historical revelation. How many other photographs, documents, and artifacts were waiting in attics and family collections, protected by guardians who understood their significance? "I think we're going to find out," Margaret replied. "This story has given people permission to share other hidden histories." The response has been overwhelming. Indeed, in the months since the Duke presentation, Margaret had been contacted by dozens of individuals and families who had their own carefully preserved materials, photographs, letters, artifacts, and oral histories that had been protected across generations. The revelation of the Tuscarora night vigil had created a ripple effect, encouraging others to step forward with their own pieces of the historical puzzle. As the ceremony continued into the night, Margaret listened to speakers from various communities share their own stories of cultural preservation and resistance. She heard about families who had hidden sacred objects from government agents, communities that had maintained traditional practices in secret, and individuals who had risked everything to preserve their cultural identity. One speaker, an elderly Catawba woman named Ruth Blue, shared a story that particularly resonated with Margaret. "My grandmother used to tell me about a night when all the tribes came together to say goodbye to the old ways," she said. She said it was the most beautiful and the saddest thing she ever witnessed. "For years, I thought it was just a story. Now I know it was history." As midnight approached, the ceremony reached its climax. Following the pattern established in the Atechontatente, the fires were allowed to burn through the night while participants shared stories, songs, and prayers. Unlike the original Vigil, however, this gathering was not about ending, but about beginning, about starting new conversations, new research projects, and new efforts to preserve and share Native American history. Margaret found herself standing next to Mary Oxendine as the night deepened. "Do you think your great-great-grandmother would approve of what we've done with her story?" she asked. Mary was quiet for a moment, watching the flames dance in the darkness. "I think Sarah would be amazed that the photograph did exactly what she hoped it would do. It preserved proof of something important, and it waited until the right moment to share that proof with the world." "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "Now the real work begins," Mary replied. "The photograph and the story were just the beginning. Now we have to figure out how to use this knowledge to help people understand the complexity and resilience of Native communities, both in the past and in the present." As dawn approached, Margaret watched the fires begin to die down naturally, just as they had in. But unlike that earlier gathering, this ceremony was not about ending, but about continuation, about ensuring that the stories and knowledge preserved by previous generations would continue to be shared and honored. The sun rose over the Lumber River, casting golden light across the clearing where so much history had been made and preserved. As the last flames flickered and died, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion and beginning, the end of one chapter in the story of the Tuscarora night vigil and the start of countless others. The photograph that had arrived anonymously on her desk 6 months earlier had done its work. It had preserved the proof of a moment when people chose dignity over despair, ceremony over surrender, hope over fear. It had waited 20 years to tell its story, and now that story was spreading like ripples across the surface of a still pond. As the gathering dispersed and people began their journeys home, Margaret remained in the clearing for a few more minutes, thinking about the weight of secrets and the courage required to reveal them at the right moment. The Tuscarora night vigil had been both an ending and a beginning, the end of one way of life and the beginning of new forms of resistance and preservation. The fires had gone cold at sunrise, but the light continued to shine in the stories that had been preserved, the knowledge that had been protected, and the dignity that had been maintained across generations of challenge and change. Margaret picked up a small piece of charcoal from one of the dying fires, adding it to the piece that Mary had given her months earlier. Together they would serve as reminders that even when fires go cold, their warmth can be rekindled by those who remember their light. The photograph had it told its story. Now it was up to future generations to decide what to do with that knowledge, how to honor the sacrifice and wisdom of those who had kept the fires burning through the longest night of their history. As Margaret walked back to her car, she carried with her not just the charcoal from the fires, but the weight of responsibility that came with being entrusted with important stories. The Tuscarora night vigil was no longer a secret, but it remained sacred, a testament to the power of memory, the importance of timing, and the enduring strength of communities that refused to let their stories die. The fires that went cold at sunrise in El Tuscarora had been rekindled, and their light would continue to shine for generations to come. From the Journal of Professor Margaret Whitmore, dated October 30, 2021, exactly 1421 years after the original Tuscarora night vigils. That day marks 1 year since the remembrance ceremony, and I find myself reflecting on how much has changed since that mysterious photograph arrived on my desk. The story of the Tuscarora night vigil has become more than just a historical discovery. It has become a catalyst for broader conversations about hidden histories, community-controlled narratives, and the importance of timing in historical revelation. The Smithsonian exhibition opened last month to overwhelming response. The photograph is displayed alongside artifacts and documents that Mary and other families have agreed to share, creating a comprehensive picture of the Tuscarora gathering and its significance. But more importantly, the exhibition has inspired other communities to come forward with their own carefully preserved stories. Thomas has completed his dissertation on the gathering and is now working with tribal communities across the Southeast to identify and document other hidden histories. Mary has established a foundation dedicated to supporting community-controlled historical research and preservation efforts. As for me, I continue to be amazed by the responsibility that comes with being entrusted with important stories. The photograph that started this journey sits framed on my office wall, a daily reminder that history is not just about the past, it is about the choices we make in the present.